Managing transformational change, no small feat, right? Introducing change is a complex endeavor, both organizational culture and individual factors to consider. I like this little guy, he's kind of cute. Any other creatures out there that actually like change besides chameleons? Another assumption about transformational change, that it's important to ensure that the context about why a change is being introduced is explained, and to define a way to measure and sustain the new changes after they're introduced. And important to recognize the need to educate and gain adoption and buy-in from leaders as drivers for change. We'll cover this all in more detail as we're going through these slides. Our approach to transformational change was that we created the Office of Transformation and Strategy Delivery as an enterprise service agency within Minnesota IT Services to partner with executive branch agencies to advance their business and portfolio management maturity as outlined in the playbook. And in one of the previous sessions, somebody had mentioned that they are going through some transformational change, but don't have that service available. So that might be, something to think about if you're thinking about forming something like this in your own realm, that having kind of a central place to channel communications, templates, tools, and knowledge management, I guess, around that, it's helpful to have the one kind of hub to do that. Our modernization maturity survey helped us to understand that base level data about each agency, which again, we reviewed in session 2. That data was used to inform the early work and to help us find focus. We did create a change agent network called the Transformation Practitioners Team, and invited representation from each of the agency's business and project management teams. So not just project managers from around the state, but also their business partners to help represent that. And that was, so it's a newly formed group. It started in last June, and it's been kind of like constant enrollment, right? Like people joining as the word gets out there about the fact that we have this. So including business architects and business team members, project management teams. So people are joining as time goes by and getting on board with that work, sharing expertise. And we have continued engagement with senior management and executive leadership as well. So I think people are starting to realize, maybe after a year of campaigning, that this thing is here to stay, and let's get our voices together and work on creating something really great. So like the playbook, adopting the change management framework was important for establishing that foundational structure to approach and manage changes. Lots of different change methodologies out there. And so my advice would be select one that's appropriate for your organization and help people to understand what that is. I've worked other places too, where people are like, this is how we do it over here. True. And we all bring our expertise in that regard, but having kind of a single one that we agree on helps with progress in that space. In the executive branch agencies, we're using the ProSci ADKAR framework, and they have invested some time and effort into training and certifying several of us. I think 12 of us have gone through the certification for that, so that was a start. This is a brief overview of ProSci's ADKAR model. It is an acronym, so the A stands for awareness. What is the need for that change? What's the nature of the change? Again, kind of that why are we doing this? D is for desire, the desire of an individual to want to change. That can be a sticky part, right? Desire to support the change, to participate and engage the change. ProSci's framework does tell us that the organizational outcomes are the collective result of individual change. So really looking at that individual's desire to change, as well as creating desire to change on a larger scale by creating other drivers for that, internal and external. We're all well aware of regulatory things that change, that kind of force us to adapt, as well as just some maybe some enhancement type things, or we used to do it this way, but we're going to be doing something different now. So how to address that desire to change. The next part of the ADKAR acronym is knowledge. Does the individual have knowledge on how to change and how to implement new skills and behaviors? And I think one of the things that I learned that was most key to this approach is that historically, managing projects and programs, we're making sure that we account for training, right? Let's make sure everybody's trained. But until we've addressed some of the things kind of upstream from there, is that individual, do they, desire to change? What's in it for them? Are they aware of why we're doing it, rather than just going directly to throwing some training at people? So something to think about with that. The second A in the ADKAR framework is ability. Does the individual or the agency have the ability to implement the change and to demonstrate performance? This box is highlighted in purple because the ADKAR framework describes that you will notice some benefits to your organization once people reach that ability to implement change. So awareness, building desire, creating the knowledge around how to do something, if it's a skill, or how to change that behavior, then you'll start to see the ability for your individuals and your groups to start changing. Then lastly, the R is for reinforcement. So always considering what things are you putting in place to sustain that change, policies, procedure updates, new hire training, and building a culture around and a competence around the change. It's important to factor that in. ProSci's best practices in change management study from 2019 listed these 7 greatest contributors to successful change in order of importance. And that first one is active and visible executive sponsorship. The second is adopting a structured change management approach. Frequent and open communication. Employee engagement and participation. Dedicated change management resources, integration and engagement with project management, and lastly, engagement with middle managers. So these items, numbers 3 through 7, are really where we're focusing our efforts on creating that transformation practitioners team as the change agent network. And we'll get into more detail on what that is here in some upcoming slides. So who or what is that? In my previous life in healthcare, we called them super users, right? So what a change agent is a champion for change. They're influential leaders, they're subject matter experts, liaisons. And what does the change agent network do? It enhances all levels of communication. So I have a graphic coming up that kind of describes this a little bit too, but in creating a new enterprise service department and working with agencies, we don't, in the transformation office, don't know all of the nuances or who's who within the agencies. And so we really need those transformation practitioners, team members to be the liaisons between their agency and the transformation office. And we expect that will help to enhance communication both ways. It provides that peer-to-peer support. People are more likely within their agency or their department to trust and listen to their coworkers more so than somebody that they're not familiar with. The Change Agent Network also shares knowledge and expertise. We have monthly meetings with this group, and then we also have so we have a 1-hour monthly meeting, kind of a regular check-in, and then we have a 1.5-hour meeting to deep dive into a topic, whatever that might be, governance or risk management, enterprise architecture, lots of great knowledge resources around all sorts of different areas. So one challenge that I have is working with people to kind of draw out that expertise and invite them to share. Lots of introverts that work in the IT space, so A little bit of work there to get people to open up and share their expertise. But we have that change agent network to help do that. It does help to build credibility of the change effort as well. Again, when people hear from their coworkers or their leaders about a change versus, somebody they don't know coming in and talking about, okay, we're gonna do this thing differently now. It helps to boost ownership of the change to have it set up this way. And the change network, again, advocates for change, identifies resistance, and works collaboratively to identify solutions. So with 22 executive branch agencies that we're working with through the Office of Transformation, each agency is at their own spot. And we say, we're working to meet with them where they're at and based on what they need. Again, kind of going back to that MMA survey as well. The agencies of most of them, we have 18 agencies that are represented of the 22, and of the 4 that aren't, they're kind of smaller. They might not have projects in the traditional sense. Some of them are review boards. One person I was working with described their agency as the state's attic, like everything that doesn't fit nicely into another category, then they kind of manage that. So we currently have 18 of the 22 executive agencies represented, and lots of interest in the group, and that interest continues to build. I do survey the group monthly as far as their overall satisfaction with the monthly meeting, the topics that are presented, and the scores for that continue to grow, as well as the participation. So I think people are appreciating the fact that we have this and that they have a place to come to for questions. They have a group of, a community of practice, basically, is what we're building across the different agencies on topics related to modernization. And this visual, it's very busy, but this visual kind of helps to illustrate some of those relationships and the complexities in introducing and managing change. And I use this one all the time. It has been very helpful for people to just see on a page just how complicated some of these things are, and the importance of having that structure in the communication channels that are here. So starting kind of at the top, over on the left, we have the legislature, and we have a technology advisory council that has a relationship with the legislature, as well as the Office of Transformation and Strategy Delivery. All of the arrows that are on here kind of, they're bi-directional. I mean, obviously there's a lot more than that, but this just helps to kind of illustrate, where the transformation practitioners team fits into all of this communication. They're highlighted here in a green circle. And as I mentioned, we have agency business partners and the agency PMO representation from each of those agencies reporting and participating in that TPT group. We also have on the lower part of this screen, you'll see 3 little dots. One of them has project management community of practice, one is business analyst community of practice, and one is business architecture community of practice. And we're seeking to solidify more of a relationship between that community of practice and the TPT, the Transformation Practitioners team, as a way to continue to draw on that expertise from those communities of practice. So those are kind of sub-communities of practice that focus on a specific discipline, whereas the TPT as a community of practice is not discipline specific. It's more centered around the modernization plays. Working further over to the right side of this graphic, agency business partners work then within their agencies with their colleagues, as well as the PMO working with their team members on up through and around their CBTO, their Chief Business Technology Officer, and then recognizing that some agencies have full communications and training departments as well. And so an attempt to connect with those channels as well, so that we're not creating any conflicting messages or unnecessary redundancy. We're also working with those groups to extract knowledge too, and use that for hey, something's working great over here at this agency. Let's talk about that at the TPT and maybe inspire some others to have that resource available to them, or maybe recreate something like that within their own agency. So let me pause for questions. Any questions so far about the communication channels, the change agent network, the TPT, and kind of what we're working to establish with creating this group?
Doesn't look like we have anything in chat. If you do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. It might be the easiest way to do that. Otherwise, Stacy will have time at the end again for additional questions.
Yes. Okay, I'll continue on. Creating change. I like this picture, the wind, right? Just change just comes out of the wind, right? I'm sure everybody can relate to that. So where do these change initiatives come from? We've mentioned the Blue Ribbon Council for IT Modernization, which is now the Technology Advisory Council. We have executive leadership direction and annual strategic planning to account for, and input from the TPT. We also have tactic work groups. The first tactic, let me advance my little ball. The first tactic includes efforts that incorporate human-centered design into future state development of projects that are expected to significantly improve the citizens' experience in accessing government services. The second tactic is project to product, or abbreviated P2P, which shifts the entire operating model into a more customer-centric product versus traditional projects. One easy way to think about this is traditionally work comes in and a project team forms around that to get it done. When a business is product-oriented, the product team is long-standing and the work on that product comes into an already formed team. The third tactic is one that I'm managing directly, and I've covered here in previous sessions, how to get the playbook introduced, identifying the work, and promoting that change and maturity within agencies. The last two tactics are closely related, but with slightly different focus. The executive portfolio reporting is aimed at creating high-level dashboards for visualization into the alignment of the project work and the overall health of the work meant for executive leaders, just to have an idea of the work that's in flight and what they need to support as far as their how that aligns to their strategic objectives. There are efforts in progress to improve the quality of project level data in order to ensure more consistency in the data that's presented to executive leaders. So recently at the state, we're working through a change that on the surface seems like it might be a small thing, but it's turned into be something bigger than a bread box, which was the standardization of project status colors as reported into our tool of record, which is Cyforma, and how each agency had created their version of what red, yellow, and green mean, as well as, some agencies were using trending data, some not. So there has been a recent effort to introduce some standard definition around that. And we worked through the TPT to collect that expertise, lots of meetings to talk about what those red, yellow, and green colors should mean, and then working with the TPT to introduce that color status change into their agency and have them kind of report back on how that's going. We have worked with individual agencies that have had, like, I don't want to say conflict like a bad thing, but just like differing information between what the standard was and what their agency uses. And then some agencies didn't have any standards around it at all. So little work in progress there. The 4-step process for introducing change is illustrated here. We have the design phase, the pilot phase, adapt, and scale. So any change that gets introduced, this is the 4-step process that we're following. In the design phase, we're working with the Technology Advisory Committee, the TPT, and then within any of those 5 annual plan tactic work groups. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's very important to have these communication channels identified. It's been very helpful to have that TPT group assembled and aware of this work. So when changes are introduced, it's not creating chaos, right? It's channeled in nicely through that group. So designing, piloting one or two groups to try something on and give feedback on how that's going, and then adapting that change or getting that change ready for it to be scaled, right? So with that project status color piece that we were working on, again, working with the TBT to design what that should be, a couple of agencies piloted it, and then we worked through the TPT to help with that, with getting it adapted into the agencies and then scaled to all agencies. I think we're all visual, right? We all people appreciate like a visualization of how all of this happens. So the TPT as the change network, change agent network needs to stay informed and engaged on all of those change efforts as they're expected to introduce the changes within their agencies and monitor for adoption of the changes over a specified time period. So the color status thing, we did set some goals, and if agencies were thinking that they weren't going to be able to meet those goals, or they wanted more time to meet with their leaders, then we certainly are flexible with all of that. So the regular monthly meetings include updates from the tactic work groups. I just have placeholders on those agendas. And then any directives or asks of the TPT team members for work in their agencies. Attendance is required for those sessions. The sessions are recorded for playback if somebody is unable to join. But as I mentioned, lots of excitement and engagement in that group as it is now. And then we have the ad hoc focus groups, again, for more in-depth conversation on a variety of topics. So everybody is added on as optional. Those sessions are also recorded for playback if somebody's not able to attend, and allows us more time to more thoroughly, those sessions are 90 minutes. So it allows us more time to really dive into a topic that we don't get in a 1-hour session with 50 people on it. The change adoption surveys are administered to TPT members on a quarterly basis, and the information is gathered and trended over time to monitor adoption and progress to our goals. This graphic helps to give a visual overview of what that expected interaction is of the 4-stage transformation process, the TPT members, any pilot group, and then the communities of practice that I had listed on that earlier graphic, working with the communities of practice for their subject matter expertise when needed to contribute that knowledge to designing the changes. It was helpful to have these graphics formed and explaining kind of how we expect the communication channels to flow. And we're just a new department, and the TPT is newly formed, so it certainly isn't perfect, but it's been really helpful to have this visual documentation to kind of outline what we think the process should be or how we want to get started with trying it out. And so far, like I said, I'm putting that anonymous survey out there. And so far the feedback's been very, very good. So I think that people are appreciating the visual documentation for explaining how we expect these changes to be communicated, how we expect to monitor them, and then always keeping my virtual door open for if anybody has anything specific that they want to talk about or address on behalf of their agency. So starting at the top of this, there's 4 swim lanes. The change leader, very generically mentioning the change leader. At this point, it's the tactic owners primarily, working within their tactic groups, which are made up of volunteers from around Minnesota IT Services, or MINIT, that pick a topic that they're interested in and then meet usually monthly for a year. So their volunteer commitment is for a year, and they bring their subject matter expertise to that tactic group. That tactic group collaborates on a kind of a mini project plan of what they're going to work on for that year. And so again, very generically, the change leader identifies a change here and then works with the TPT and the discipline-specific community of practice to design what that change should look like. The TPT then, just moving over to the right on here, volunteers to pilot the change, iteratively improves that as issues are identified, and then gets that work ready to scale. I've mentioned in the previous sessions that we have a SharePoint site that we use for internally, as an internal resource for education and communication tools. So publishing those to SharePoint. We have an instructional designer that we've worked with to kind of help with framing, I would say framing how the content is presented so that it's presented consistently and not, all change leaders are creating something totally different. So some uniformity, some standards around what those knowledge resources become. And then continuing on with scaling that change, again, working with the TBT on more of a whole scale to get those changes introduced in their agency, and working again with that group to monitor that progress on change adoption. So this flow has been working out pretty well so far. Again, it's new, but so far so good. So recall from the last presentation, all of the modernization maturity assessment data. And this is a summary of all of them rolled up into one dashboard. So in summary, that select and run phases are scored lower overall for agencies. Again, this was from 2020. And since then, Minute's been building maturity around application portfolio management, and the transformation office has been primarily focused on the select phase and those gaps identified by all agencies. So helpful again to have that visual. I've been using this in conversation with agencies on, here's the dashboard of how all agencies are, and here's how your agency has ranked themselves. Your agency's leaders have ranked themselves compared to that. And I think it's been a helpful thing for them to see, like, hey, we're actually doing better than the average, or, we've got a little work to do. But as I mentioned too, the application portfolio management phase, which is, you'll recall from previous sessions, in that run, and everybody has kind of scored low in that. So application portfolio management, I think, is a big modernization maturity target that will benefit everybody. And like I said, there's been a lot of work around that. So I would expect that in our next reporting period this summer, that score will improve significantly. So using that quarterly adoption survey, so we've got the modernization maturity assessment survey, which will be done yearly, every 2 years. And this is more the incremental quarterly specifics to the tactics or specific things that are being introduced, and kind of brings it down from a macro level more to a micro level of monitoring changes specifically within those agencies. The survey has been a communication mechanism for agencies to identify whether they want additional support from the transformation office when introducing that change. The select phase adoption metrics, those 3 that are listed here, the idea intake process, an idea decision-making approval gate, using a business case to inform project selection for modernization and mid to large scale project requests. And the feedback we got on that was that it's very difficult to parse out something that's a large IT modernization project versus everything else. So many of the agencies are working to adopt the playbook in total for all of their IT projects, and in some cases their business projects. Oftentimes they're managed by the same pool of people. So just for simplicity purposes, a lot of what is introduced in the playbook is good structure for all of the work. And there's a lot of adoption for the plays, not just for modernization projects. That's a mouthful. And then lastly, the business case agency decision-making or approval gate. And this graphic on the next slide here, this adoption dashboard, I did kind of blank out the agency names just for confidentiality there, but you can get an idea of how the incremental survey data is used. It's a little bit of a busy slide, but the select phase, I just have the select phase shown here, and just a quick visual indicator of, do they have it or not? Are they working on it? Do they kind of have it? You know, the key here is there's 4 scales of this key. They don't have it, they're working on it, or they ranked it a 2 in their modernization maturity assessment survey. They ranked it a 3 if they kind of have it. Like some of the larger agencies have subdivisions within them. And so if they answered that, you know, some of our divisions are doing it, but not all, then they got that green circle. And then fully functioning means agency-wide, that they have a process that guides that activity. And then the progress summary table. Again, this is counted quarterly. We worked with our leaders to set some goals, and you can see that we're trending very nicely toward our goals. All kinds of kudos to the TPT for their hard work on this, in working with their agencies to establish governance, to use the business case to inform that work, and that they have a business case governance process in place. And you'll recall from the Modernization Playbook session, the first one that we had, that those kind of gated decision-making points were some key change that were introduced with the playbook. And so how well are agencies doing that based on their TPT team members reporting that in? As I mentioned, you know, that using that survey is a helpful way as well to get an idea of who needs what in terms of education. And one of the questions is whether your agency's business leaders need education or team members. So we do have distinctly different education around what do the leaders need to know about that versus what does somebody who's actually doing it, or a team member or practitioner, need to know about how to complete a business case. And what we're hearing from a lot of the agencies is that they are using a business analyst in that role to help with defining that. So business team members who aren't used to filling out business cases, or maybe only do it once every couple of years, are benefiting from having a business analyst resource available to help them to complete that business case, as well as some of the self-guided education that we have. And then do you request assistance from the Transformation Office to create an education plan with you for your agency? And a lot of people are, you can see the numbers here, Q1, people said yes or maybe. And Q2, we got no yes responses, but some maybes. So, maybe in the future, I kind of reserve the right to work with the Transformation Office if I need it, but there's a lot of independent work going on within the agency, but we want to, again, be that resource as needed. So lots of, we're creating a lot of knowledge resources. The SharePoint site's accessible to anybody within the state, the TPT group, and ensuring that those TPT team members are informed, that they have resources available to them, but also that they're sharing their expertise. So just for example, today, one of the TPT members is working on a brown bag session for project sponsors within their agency. And they're really excited to share that work with the rest of the TPT, because other members of the TPT have said that would be a really helpful thing for us to have. So we're working on creating some enterprise level project sponsor education and have that available on our SharePoint site, again, for people to kind of self-select it if they want it. But rather than having 22 agencies creating their own thing for project sponsorship, we're working to kind of centralize that using the knowledge of the group and some of the initiatives that are in flight. That's been a helpful thing. So in summary, you know what, maybe I'll pause for questions here. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they'd like to talk about with anything that has been presented? It's a lot of information, and I recognize that it kind of builds on, you know, an assumption that you have some knowledge about what the playbook is and kind of how we arrived at, you know, how do we find focus in our work? And so anyway, let me shut up for a second. Any questions or comments about any of this so far?
Yeah, this is Gabriella Sertani from Minute working with DOT. Hi, Stacy.
Hi.
And with the kind of that every other year evaluation, are you going to use any? Because it seemed very qualitative to me when we did it, where we had a group of people together, and it was sort of, and they were higher level, so they're not actually involved in the actual projects. And so we're asking them to kind of evaluate based on, I'm guessing, some of their experience and then some of hearing stories to give those scores. And I've been trying to push them to come to something a little more quantitative, because one part is we're going to have a 50% turnover at least in the people doing the scoring. So you have completely different people doing this assessment, maybe using different criteria to give that. So I'm not sure how, if you're planning on anything that tries to kind of account for some of those, smooth out some of those potential variables and biases of people's experience.
Right, that's a great point. We do have turnover, right, in state government leadership at the agencies. And with that MMA survey or Modernization Maturity Assessment Survey, that the business leader who completed the survey, I think that's what you're saying, right? The business leader that completed that survey might not be there in 2 years to complete that survey again. And what we're working to establish is some of that visual documentation, and then working with the agency's leaders, business leaders, CBTOs, on what their modernization map looks like for their agency, so that when a new leader comes in or a new agency team member comes in, that they have that information available to them and can kind of pick up the work where it is, adding their contributions to it, not that they have to reinvent the wheel with each administration change or with each you know, leader change that comes in. So that's part of it. And then the quality of the questions, or like what's in the question, I do expect that will evolve over time. So for example, we're focusing heavily on the select phase, and we know that people are doing much better with that than 2 years ago. So of the 33 questions that are in there, at some point, some of them will become not pertinent anymore. And maybe we need to add some different ones in as we become, you know, more adaptive, more agile, more product oriented. So I think having that visual kind of baseline of where we are now, tracking those changes over time, I think will help to kind of address some of that maturity over time, and not that each agency is kind of starting back at square one when a new person gets hired. Does that help to answer the question, Gabriella? And would you like to be part of the planning?
No, I think it's good. I'm thinking of things where they were making, they didn't really have metrics to look at. So when the question was, you know, we have our processes understood before we start projects, you know, some would say, because they had maybe been on a project years ago where it did, and they go, oh yeah, we're pretty good at that. And then other people would be like, oh, I don't think in my experience we were good at that. And then they were kind of going off what they thought without having any kind of, you know, numbers. So we're trying to have adding in DOT some kind of checklist before projects, so at least we can start to gather some numbers.
Yeah. I have to say DOT is one of the forerunners on all of this modernization work, and a testament to you and your expertise, Gabriella, of business architecture and how absolutely critical that skill set is to any of this. So kudos to you. It'd be cool to hear back from you on how that's going and whether you have any suggestions for how that can be scaled to other agencies as well. Any other questions? If not, we'll kind of move on to some of the key takeaway messages from this session. Awareness, again, and desire to be accounted for in this model. Often a pitfall, many of us are familiar with this, is the training piece. True in general, that people need to know how to employ a change, but in order to promote a more successful long-term adoption, one must consider the aspects of awareness of the need for the change and exploring ways to create some desire for change. If someone isn't aware of why a change is needed, or if they just decide they don't want to change their ways and adopt a new thing, then training them is really not going to help them in adopting the change. So one key point here is working to create personal and organizational motivators. One example of how we're doing this is through one of the tactics in improving the transparency of portfolio health data to executive leaders, and that change that was introduced on standardizing how those input fields are used across the agencies with the traffic light status colors, and how that created sort of an external motivator for those people who are responsible for recording what those status colors mean, now that their agencies, executive leaders, and even the state's executive branch leaders looking at those projects over, in one dashboard. So looking at some of those higher profile, higher cost, several criteria for what makes it onto a key initiative dashboard, but that whoever's consuming that information has the knowledge that there's consistency in what those colors mean. And that helped to create some of that, again, that external desire to change because people are looking at it now. So D, building desire to implement changes, being clear in describing what's in it for me when introducing the change. One level of experience that I've gained in the past year of working here is that in planning the communications and training and all of that, I try to address the what's in it for me earlier in the presentation rather than waiting for it later. And that was based on some feedback from an instructional designer. So people are more likely to tune into it, to what the changes that you're introducing, if you're describing what it is, what's in it for them earlier on when introducing the change. Creating those personal and organizational motivators through leadership education and support. If you think back to those 7 criteria for successful change, that active and engaged middle manager level, empowering those people who lead other people by ensuring that they understand what the change is and can help to lead that change within their direct reports. I've heard from my colleagues here at the state that historically it might just be some broadcast email out to everybody that we've got this new thing, and we're working to be more intentional with engaging the leaders and the middle managers to help them build the desire for change within their direct reports, and also empowering them to be able to do that more successfully. And then building knowledge on how to employ those changes and thinking about how the education is delivered and structured, trying to reduce chaos in communications where possible, and again, individual level change that individual knows how to employ a change. Building ability within each individual team member, again, working with their supervisors, working with them as individuals, creating multiple ways for them to get the knowledge. Here at the state, we have the benefit of having communities of practice for disciplines. We have a great deal of focus on accessibility and multiple ways to reach individual team members. That way to, again, build that ability within each individual on the change. And then sustaining the changes by reinforcing new skills, policies, and processes. So eventually, all of these changes that we're introducing now will just become the way things are done, and the way that the culture, right? It will change the culture over time, but it's not something that's just simply done by saying, okay, well, we have this playbook now, so this is how we do it. It's not that easy. So looking at our policies, our processes, our HR aspects, job descriptions, and then making available knowledge and skills resources to help with, to reinforce all of these changes that we're introducing. Okay, quick game, true or false? When approaching organizational change, it's important to take a one-size-fits-all approach in order to drive for standardization. You can just go off mute and say true or false.
False.
Sorry.
Right on. It is false. We don't want to take a one-size-fits-all approach. In our case, again, we have very large scale organization-wide, enterprise-wide changes going on, multiple different agencies, divisions within those agencies. It takes time, it takes patience. Very helpful to have that ADKAR model that we're working on so that we at least have a similar framework. So again, not a one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, question 2. It's desirable to use more than one change management framework when introducing and implementing large-scale changes. A new volunteer? Sandra, it looks like you came off
Is
mute.
this false? Is this false?
This is false, you're right. It's very helpful to have one change management framework when introducing and implementing large-scale changes. Question 3, there are 4 questions, by the way. Active and engaged leadership support is a critical success factor for any change management effort.
That's true.
That is true. All right, last question. Project management and organizational change management are separate disciplines. Strength in both areas on projects are more likely to lead to successful project outcomes and change adoption. Brian, are you off mute?
I would say that's true.
You are correct. That is true. If you have any questions, I can be reached at this email. Also, a couple of links in here. Do you think I need to probably share those in the chat, huh?
That would be great if you could.
Yeah, let me add those here. This first link that I'm sharing is a link to the Modernization Playbook public site. And then this one's very interesting too, the Blue Ribbon Council on Information Technology. Lots of great information there about what all of that is and progress going on there.
And also, don't forget that, of course, IPD does do change management, project management. We'll certainly come out and do customize our training specific to your organization if you're interested.
Thanks, everybody.